Across the Sun by Jason Pagano and Bill Robinson. Chapter 11. The Reverie. Part of dwarf culture included renewing the spirit. Work and training were important, but without a strong spirit, one might come to believe the meaning of life was to work and train until death. Saba called a rainy day of leisure a reverie. She explained that on days like these, they could get closer to their dreams, and a dream was the voice of their subconscious, be it sleep, daydreaming, or even hallucinations. The idea of enjoying sleep vexed Aeden.
Sure, if it was as easy as an afternoon nap,
he said once. Niwa surprised him by grabbing and holding his hand, looking at him sympathetically. For Aeden, restlessness was like another member of the family, wandering through the house. Yet they discussed this so rarely. 3 days after the incident at Raven's Cross, the rains fell throughout the night and into mid-morning. By the early afternoon, the sun had reappeared, providing the perfect day for spiritual renewal. The siblings ventured out to the pond through the woods behind their house.
Aeden, your bruises appear to have healed up nicely. I'm glad to see that,
Rukaryu said. He was thoroughly enjoying swimming. His head remained above the surface as he stretched and posed beneath the water.
if you thought my bruises were bad, you should have seen the other guy,
the human joked, trying to brush off his trauma.
It's strange how little Saba and Gorram have discussed it with us,
Niwa said.
Think we'll be allowed back next week?
Not a confident swimmer, she often relaxed in the pond's shallows.
It's improbable the village has erected gates to keep us out.
Rukaryu dunked himself under the water.
Miss Saba knows everything.
Aeden was waist-deep, looking at his wavering reflection, when he noticed Clyde a dozen paces away, studying his chagrin.
I guess it's sweet you insist on Miss and Professor, although I'd argue Miss Saba easily teaches you as much as Gorram does.
Niwa waited for a nod or some other acknowledgement she spoke the truth. She found some comfort in knowing Aeden loved their mother more actively than their father, whether he could admit that or not.
Clyde,
Aeden said.
I meant to ask before, do you think those watching us in the woods were the thugs in town?
Rukaryu had resurfaced and was listening intently.
Probably not. There were more of them in the woods,
The Tikis answered flatly.
Oh good, I was afraid we didn't have anything to worry about.
Niwa often turned to sarcasm when distressed. She marveled sometimes how her sister could so easily say something that sounded ominous to others. Maybe this was her method of de-escalating tension, implying she wasn't worried. The gnome vacillated between feeling frustrated and gracious. Rukaryu said,
Raven's Cross can't have more than a few dozen residents. I only briefly saw the thugs. I didn't see who was in the woods, but none of you ever saw them in town before, right? Should we assume a group of delinquents is roaming the area?
It was true. The siblings hadn't recognized the men. Then again, Gorram had sort of instilled in his children a feeling of being outsiders when they were in town. Their father had explained that most people would ask questions about their family but didn't really want to understand them. They were special, and he didn't want anyone to make them feel they weren't.
Wouldn't Professor Gorram warn us if he thought these jerks wanted revenge?
Aeden thought about Saba. He'd always assumed she had some sort of psychic ability, but she hadn't said anything. Either they were getting worked up over nothing, or something they hadn't understood had happened. The aftermath of the trip to Raven's Cross still felt shockingly anticlimactic to him. Most of the day, Clyde had been indulging in one of her quirks, which was to orbit around her siblings. She swam, wandered around the pond, and looked around most of all. She'd been pacing during their discussion. She noticed her brother was now studying her, possibly hoping for more insight.
Arcana is special, and some other magic even more so.
Clyde offered, fixated on the woods.
People want to steal things of value.
In the distance, she heard a branch snapping. Multiple creatures were running. There was an abrupt crashing sound in the brush.
Something approaches,
she said, running around the pond's perimeter. Niwa, Aeden, and Rukaryu knew this was not a drill. They gathered their things, putting clothing on to their wet bodies. The Urtica sister reached for her dagger. Chapter 12. Hobgoblin Assault. From several directions, hobgoblins crested the low hills around the pond. They were unmistakable, though none of the teenagers had ever beheld one before. These were creatures from Saba's stories, mongrels with pale green skin and pronounced tusks on a vicious underbite. They advanced indirectly, darting left and right. There was no time to prepare. Niwa felt defenseless and paralyzed with fear. Her primal instinct to flee eclipsed the arcane words to any magic spell. She was forgetting even her siblings. She needed to run. She saw Aeden jump into the water, probably to get Ricario. The voices of her great ancestors were silent. She needed to focus on her own. There'd be safety in numbers. Niwa cautiously paddled further into the pond. The center of the pond was very deep. However, Ricario appeared to be standing with most of his chest above the waterline. He looked encouragingly at his fearful sister.
Draw them in!
Aeden shouted to Clyde, who was weaving through trees and nearing the pond once again. The siblings saw 4 hobgoblins who all looked emaciated. How could they move so quickly and deftly without collapsing from fatigue? What had once been clothing was now shreds and tatters hanging from them, like decaying husks off a withered crop. They were ferocious and had nothing left to lose. One hobgoblin ran into the water after Niwa. Splashing desperately, she started a breaststroke to right herself. She felt searing pain cut through her right leg as the pursuing hobgoblin launched herself, slashing her short sword on her way down. The attack carved a deep gash into the back of the gnome's calf muscle down to her heel, and a cloud of blood bloomed in the water around her. Niwa would have roared in pain, but as she tried to draw a breath underwater, she choked violently. She writhed and thrashed, causing her wound to split. When she finally surfaced, her cry was superseded by her vomiting into the water just below her nose. Because Clyde was small and stealthy, she'd not drawn the hobgoblin's focus. This was, she decided, going to be like combat training with the uncanny image, but with her sister's life at stake. She somersaulted onto the enemy's back, leaned forward, and stabbed her knife into the enemy's neck. As Clyde leapt away, the limp body floated up and rolled over as pond water and blood fell from its open mouth and punctured throat. Niwa's vision had blurred. She bumped into something while shoving away from her own vomit and turned to see the hobgoblin's dead, bulging eyes. The blurriness was a blessing, making the trauma less acute. After a second of shock, she retrieved a short sword from the lifeless hand. One hobgoblin was foolish enough to charge into the water at Ricario, his dagger extended forward like a poor man's lance. As the hobgoblin awkwardly thrust his crude weapon, Ricario drove his knee into the hobgoblin's sternum. Everyone heard the sound of cracking bone as the hobgoblin buckled in on himself, choking. As he sunk, his outstretched hand pulled down, driving the dagger into the elf's thigh. Ricario grabbed the hobgoblin by the base of his skull, holding his submerged head firmly. The hobgoblin struggled, pushing desperately, and fighting to pull himself above the water, but there was no salvation. Then the mage covered the hobgoblin's mouth. Focusing his arcana, he altered the minor spell, Create Flame, and within seconds ice began forming inside and around the struggling hobgoblin's mouth, obstructing his airway. The flesh around his mouth rimed and darkened from a mossy gray to a necrotic black. Ricario released the now limp body. The dagger throbbed in the mage's leg, but it would remain there until he'd neutralized the bigger threats. Aeden, still in the pond, had swum to aid Niwa after she'd been attacked. Now, the remaining 2 hobgoblins dashed into the water after him. Ricario was several strokes away from Aeden as the enemy closed in, but he swung his hands in an arc to push water toward the closer hobgoblin. Surprisingly, a large wave swelled from his hands and crashed down on one hobgoblin, buffeting her in its wake and dragging her under. Clyde had run around the pond's edge so she could attack the hobgoblin as she emerged from the pond. Her knife, still covered in blood from her first kill, connected solidly. While flailing, the hobgoblin's dagger glanced off Ricario's collarbone, flaying skin and slicing part of his neck. The elf reeled. He'd been trying to ignore the pain in his thigh, but now clutched his neck to attempt to stop the blood loss. He felt desperately vulnerable. He clenched his teeth and pulled the dagger from his thigh, plunging it into the hobgoblin's chest. With a splash, her body collapsed face up in the pond. Aeden had nearly reached Niwa when a hobgoblin attacked him with an overhead stab. The human intercepted the stroke with his hand, burying his palm about halfway into the blade. He yelled out, grabbing for his assailant's wrist with his other hand. Aeden took a glancing fist that just missed his temple. He bucked forward with a vicious headbutt, connecting with the hobgoblin's nose. There were more cracking sounds as bones and cartilage were pushed deeper into the creature's skull. Blood poured from the hobgoblin's nose and eyes, and his recoil turned his sharp tusk into a sickle that ripped off part of Aiden's nose. The human also recoiled and quickly covered his bloody face. Niwa struggled to swim closer to Aeden. She still carried the assassin's short sword. A few strokes felt like an eternity to her.
Behind you!
She shouted to her brother. The hobgoblin heard this and ducked beneath the surface, anticipating an attack. Aeden accepted Niwa's short sword with his gored hand. He pulled the hobgoblin out from the water and thrust the sword into the soft area under his chin, killing the last combatant. The pond was eerily still. Brushing wet hair from his face, Aeden scanned the tree line.
Clyde?
Chapter 13. Recollection. Aeden tried to shake off his adrenaline rush. All imminent threats were defeated, at least for now. Rikaryu, blood flowing from his neck, was extending his hands to lift Niwa. She was having difficulty treading water and looked awfully pale.
Rook, can you lower yourself in the water?
Aeden moved closer to his siblings. His brother complied, holding his sister gently along the water margin. Aeden thought he knew what he was supposed to do next, but still felt unsure. His healing hands had helped his siblings in the past, but he'd never seen his loved ones so hurt. Rikaryu had clear eyes and a soft complexion, making him look dignified all the time, but now he was barely holding it all together. Aeden put his injured hands on Rikaryu's neck. The elf winced at the touch, even as he continued to gaze at his sister in his arms.
You know I believe. I need you to believe in me now.
Gray flames appeared in Aiden's hands. They heard something that sounded like ropes tightening. Then the puncture wound on Aiden's hand started to close. The slice in his brother's neck appeared to clot, undergoing rapid stypsis, closing and forming new skin over itself. Rikaryu carefully held Niwa's slashed leg. Aeden moved his hands to her calf, and this gash also began to close. The gray flames brushed against the water without resistance. Niwa could hardly believe her eyes. The disfiguring injury to Aiden's nose appeared to unmake itself. This was the power her brother had tried to hide. In a way, he had also healed her despair. She'd assumed they were all going to die in this pond. Clyde had run into the woods, certain another hobgoblin was watching the bloodbath in the pond, monitoring the melee. Every movement had been reactionary and instinctual. A noise to her left. Someone fleeing with a quiver of arrows. Her adrenaline was surging. After a lengthy pursuit, she stopped. In an instant, she felt her lungs burning and her legs aching. She was separated from the others and could be ambushed. She was alone, without her weapon. She saw no trace of a fleeing hobgoblin. The Tikas leaned against a felled tree and breathed hard. The breathing was painful, and she could feel pressure and pain behind her eyes. Abruptly, she leaned over and vomited. Then, collecting herself, Clyde jogged back to the pond. 4 lifeless bodies floated in the pond, which was now tinted a wretched reddish brown. Aeden and Niwa were out of the water and looked much better from the injuries she'd seen them receive. Aiden's nose looked intact, but the area from his mouth to his right eye looked raw and delicate, as though he'd been scalded with hot water. He hadn't bothered to move his hair from his face as he often did when it was wet. Niwa was standing and drying herself off, but she seemed hesitant to put weight on her leg. The wound was closed now, but a gash resembling a bad rope burn trailed to her heel.
Something is wrong with my leg.
Tears cleaned paths down her face, which was covered in blood and dirt. Aeden assessed her injury.
The tendon is torn. I don't understand why it isn't mending. Inside me, there's this feeling like an emptiness right now. I'm so sorry, Niwa, but I promise to try again later. Rook can carry you back.
Typically, Niwa considered her brothers to be chivalrous. For an instant, she was surprised Aeden was delegating responsibility. Then she noticed how fatigued and pallid he looked. She realized he was acting out of sheer necessity. Lucario waded through the pond, searching the bodies. He found no identification, but did notice a strange mark on one hobgoblin's foot. Though crude, the symbol looked like two spikes or arrowheads pointing in opposite directions. He then noticed this mark on the other's feet as well. These attackers had been nearly starved and almost naked. None had carried any material possessions. Clyde, who had rejoined the group quietly, almost smiled when she saw her brother wade out of the pond and perform his standard drying technique, shivering from head to toe until completely dry. Aeden had secured their belongings and clothes in a cotton towel he now carried over his shoulder like a sack. Lucario picked up Niwa and smiled thankfully when he noticed Clyde a few paces away. As they walked home, no one glanced back at the desecrated pond. Aeden sighed.
Professor Gorram is going to be furious.
I'm just thankful tomorrow won't be today again.
Niwa said. She felt silly being carried home by her brother.
We were attacked. The last thing you should worry about is getting in trouble. We've already had more than enough as it is.
You're right. There could be more on the way.
Aeden examined the scabs from his recent injury. Still, he thought it would be better not to admit to Gorram he'd used the magic his father disapproved of so adamantly. Lucario began to describe the markings on the hobgoblin's feet. Clyde ran to a nearby tree to retrieve a stray arrow sticking out of its trunk. She hadn't seen any archers, and she was certain that arrow hadn't been there that morning. Chapter 14. Camera Obscura. Saba stood on the roof, surveying the land surrounding their home. She felt like a woman tied to a wheel of death, trying to smile placidly at a carnival crowd as someone threw knives at her spinning body. Maybe she didn't have to be the calm and collected one today. Maybe she could let herself cry alone up here. If she could focus on crying, she wouldn't have to focus on the large group of invaders who would descend on the property before nightfall. She couldn't see them yet, but was thankful she could only sense them for now. The dwarf looked down at her feet. She saw an old roof on a house that had good, solid bones. She also noticed Niwa's hand mirror. That's right, she thought. They used this special place as well. Of course they did. She and Gorram had selected these children because they were magnificent. Somehow, last night, they'd convinced their children to try and get some sleep. Everyone had been distraught, but Gorram had explained they were only upset at the situation. After giving them some warm soup and time to calm down, they had asked their children to describe what had happened. From the hobgoblin's tactics, physical descriptions, and cultish tattoos, both parents were convinced the hobgoblins were just harbingers of a larger order beginning to advance. This was not a time for sorrow, it was a time for action. Saba glanced one final time at the bucolic place she and her partner Gorram had lived for nearly 20 years, in a house older than both of them combined. Then, closing her eyes, she began chanting in a slow crescendo. She tilted her head up and opened her eyes to see an immense cloying fog cloud cast far afield around the house. The gloom blocked the daylight, making it appear nighttime. She hoped this fog cover would buy them a little time to prepare a retreat. Today would be the end of an era.
I'm ready to fight, Professor,
Aeden said.
and you can use your magic too.
They're going to destroy this place. It's already over.
Gorram barked. He just heard his own plea to Saba repeated in this room and denied it. Clenching his eyes shut, he tried to collect himself. A latent hostility towards his human son came so naturally to him, for which he always felt penitent.
Gather your things, all of you. There's no time to waste.
Where will we go?
Niwa asked, fighting back tears.
Remember our talk the other day about other worlds?
The old dwarf was hustling to his study. Lucario and Niwa followed him in, feeling for the first time they were permitted to do so. The room was a mess. Piles of parchment were on every available surface, along with drafting materials strewn about the floor. Without windows, the study had always felt dark and foreboding. None of the siblings had ever dared to poke around in there. They had always assumed Saba would have somehow known if they had.
Rook, light please.
Gorram held out something that looked like a disc of polished agate. Still distracted, he was also rummaging through paperwork. Rukaryu didn't understand at first, but then chanted briefly and covered his hand over the stone. As he touched it, his light spell illuminated concentric rings of violet color. Suddenly, hundreds of symbols and points and marks appeared in luminescent paint on the walls and ceiling. The darkened space felt infinite and alive.
Did you paint the stars?
Niwa asked, mesmerized.
I certainly did. Excellent deduction.
Gorram found the item he'd been searching for. He placed the agate on the floor and then set a strange glass framework over it. The light was now focused in a column extending to the ceiling. He studied the glowing charts intently. The group also looked up at the ceiling. Rukaryu noticed Clyde watching from the hallway and saw she'd complied with Gorham's instructions to pack a rucksack. The odd lighting played against his sister's short gray fur, making her look faded somehow, and he realized he and the others must look surreal as well.
Would one of you please fetch your brother?
Gorram, with his finger, moved to count dots overhead. Clyde darted down the hallway obediently. Gorram lingered over one particular dot. He asked,
When was the last full moon?
Confused, the siblings looked at one another. Niwa remembered having had a spirited discussion with her great-grandmother by the light of the last full moon.
3 nights ago.
She tried to answer quickly.
Confirmed.
He said.
25 days in. Second trine. Good.
Gorham's finger moved toward a different point above.
Right then. Where's my T-square?
Your tea what?
Rukaryu had never heard of such a thing. He looked to his sister, who shook her head.
It's been much too long. I might be out of practice,
The dwarf said.
I do regret my failure to teach all of you about cartography, even the fundamentals.
He went to a wicker basket that was filled with crumpled papers. Reaching behind that pile, he produced an implement resembling a flimsy wooden pickaxe. It, too, was partially covered in glowing paint. Holding the drafting implement, Gorram walked to the far wall. He gently probed his fingers along the crevices between the boards. At one point, he nodded, shoving the T-square in the crevice. It held in place easily. Without letting go, Gorram asked his children, who were watching him intently.
Move this junk out of the way, would you?
Rukaryu and Niwa gathered a chair and stack of papers. Aeden had appeared in the doorway, noticing the study was suffused with violet light and splatters of glowing paint.
I helped Miss Saba off of the roof.
He said, unsure of what else to say or do.
Rook, Niwa, go pack, quickly.
Gorram commanded as he struggled with the implement. The siblings, continuing to gawk, slowly backed out of the room, nearly colliding with Aeden.
She told me they won't reach the house until later tonight.
Aeden reported, still not sure who she meant.
Professor, we still have time to prepare. We can defeat them.
He had done as instructed and packed a rucksack. They heard a faint clicking sound. Gorram applied force to his drafting implement, and several wall boards slid back on small casters. Aeden had had no idea their childhood home had a false wall. He was sure his siblings hadn't known either.
It is almost noon.
Gorram said irritably.
The sun is highest in the sky. We don't have time to wait for military theater to come to our front door. Remember what I said the other day about jumping really high?
Aeden felt a certain hostility his father always seemed to reserve just for him. He acquiesced.
All right. What can I do to help?
Gorham's tense face relaxed.
Come downstairs with me now, but then I'll need you back on the roof.
He nodded and walked through the secret passage. They entered a corridor devoid of light. Aeden felt as if he were entering a cave. Thinking of his father's safety, he thought to grab the strange violet spotlight.
No use for that.
Saba said from the door. She offered him a wan smile.
The camera obscura needs to be completely dark.
The what?
He allowed his mother to lead him down the dark passageway. His feet recognized a ramp, and his hand felt a length of rope suspended to the wall. A faint white light emanated from a small chamber below. Aeden's eyes quickly adjusted to the low lighting, and he saw Gorram hunched over a small storage cabinet. As he joined his father, he caught his reflection in what he thought was a slanted tabletop. When he stood before it, the room felt dimmer. He stepped aside, and the light reflected back onto the wall.
Here it is.
Gorram said, retrieving something from the cabinet that resembled framed stained glass the size of a dinner plate. Gorram presented it to his son. Aeden handled the piece carefully. Even in dim light, he saw how intricate the piece's detail was. It might have been a painting of a mountain top with houses surrounded by dense forests.
You're going to bring this piece to the roof.
Gorram began to explain.
Up there, you'll see a few openings on the sunshade tube. Only one will fit this slide. A thin slot on the tube's side. You'll see it.
The sunshade tube? Do you mean the stovepipe?
Aeden, confused, regretted having to ask. Gorram almost chuckled.
My boy, we don't have a stove. You should know better than anyone. You're a fine baker who knows his way around the chimenea.
Aeden realized this was true. Then he wondered if all of his siblings knew what function the pipe on the roof served, and if they'd never mentioned it to him because they'd assumed he already knew.
Of course, I was just testing you.
His son replied.
You'll insert the slide at an angle, like this.
Gorram gesticulated with open hands.
This frame will protrude from the opening and serve as a handle, so the piece can be removed later. Although, I suppose there won't be a later here.
We're not coming back, are we?
Aeden asked quietly.
Always move forward, son.
Gorram looked him straight in the eyes.
Now get going, and come back down here when you're done. Gotta leave soon, before they destroy everything.
Aeden looked at the white light from the pipe overhead. He went through the darkness and back up the ramp. Chapter 15. Stress Fractures. Outside the world was foreboding and gloomy, which made inside the house unusually dark. As Aeden passed his siblings, carrying this strange-looking plate, they studied him, wishing for answers, but saw only his look of abject dread. They didn't dare ask him what he was doing. Aeden stepped into the thick mist. He often ascended these stairs 2 at a time, but now he climbed slowly and carefully, knowing this would be the last time he used them. In the dormitory he stopped, taking it all in. He'd never have another restless night of sleep here again. He climbed out the window and ascended with the glass tucked under his arm. On the roof, Aeden surveyed his homestead. Beneath the sunny sky above, the garden and his wheat crops were buried in a fog. He'd spent many years weeding that garden. He remembered the time Niwa had been startled by a snake while gathering vegetables for dinner. The crops would go to ruin anyway if invaders destroyed the house, he thought bitterly. There was his stovepipe. Aeden felt silly touching the sturdy pipe that had never discharged heat or smoke. He identified the opening Gorram had described. Aeden tried to shake his feeling that the plate's reflection wasn't getting brighter. This weird plate couldn't be getting warmer in his hands. No, the brightness and heat were above him. High above the house, an object fell from space. The sky was turning crimson as something eclipsed the sun's light. Awestruck, he released his grip on the plate, causing it to slide forcefully into the opening. The sound of glass hitting the metal pipe alarmed him.
I didn't hear it shattering.
He reassured himself.
No, it didn't break. It didn't.
In the valley, under a big sky, everyone in the house had seen the occasional shooting star. This, however, was a large, brilliant flame passing overhead. Aeden felt awe, but also helplessness. Craning his head to follow the object's path as it blazed across the sky, he lost his footing and slid off the roof, crashing to the ground in a heap. His shoulder was never going to heal right at this rate. He groaned, climbing to his feet. Immediately, his eyes returned to the sky. Through the fog, Aeden could still see the fiery glow. It looked like a bird of fire gliding away to the horizon. With a clang, a gentle portrait replaced the white light projecting against the wall. Magnificent colors blanketed the room and the family. A landscape appeared before them. Although abstract, the interplay of whites and greens seemed to depict clouds and trees.
But This isn't Arcana.
Clyde said. She disliked situations she didn't understand, as they made her feel vulnerable and unsure.
Not yet.
Gorram replied.
This is what is known as a camera obscura. It's an old invention that manipulates light to recreate an image in a darkened room. Your brother slotted an image in just now.
Rikaryu wasn't sure which question he wanted to ask first.
Is that the strange artwork you purchased from Seedsea?
Niwa looked at her father stupefied. That trip into town had exasperated her. It made her physically ill until she'd had a full night's rest. No one had mentioned a thing about artwork. Standing in a dimly lit room she'd known nothing about, she wondered if she was the last to know everything in this family.
No, that plate is still in the cabinet with the others.
The young elf was still trying to collect his thoughts.
But Aeden is on the roof. How is his action affecting us here in this cellar?
This is no ordinary camera obscura.
Gorram replied proudly, as though his children had seen others before.
The lens extends from the roof to this room. You know it better as the dormitory sliding pole.
He let his words linger so as to catch glints of wonderment in their eyes.
You mean this is daylight shining through that pole, which is really just a telescopic lens? That's incredible.
Rikaryu marveled at the pipe overhead.
What are we doing down here?
Niwa asked sternly, trying to hide her nervousness.
I mean, if a bunch of invaders are on their way here, aren't we going to be cornered in this room?
Saba said,
This device will allow us to travel to another world. Gorram will channel the Arcana as soon as Aeden returns. The image helps us focus on a distant place.
I don't understand. You told me the painting was a paradox. Doesn't that mean there is no such place?
Rikaryu saw the painting more abstractly again.
Some spells require a material component.
Gorram said.
A blind child couldn't paint a world she'd seen, thus, she painted another world. The painting is the ingredient we need to travel to another world. It's not a map.
Wow. Even the concept sounds abstract.
Despite years of study and practice, Rikaryu considered just how little he understood Arcana.
If it's an ingredient, doesn't that mean it's consumed when the spell is cast?
Perhaps. That's why I have more.
Gorram looked to the cabinet, then sighed.
But who cares about ingredients when we lose the damned kitchen?
Niwa looked upset. Saba changed the subject.
It's not just any world. Your father and I have traveled for many years. Imagine seeing every tree and mountain and cloud at once. Can you see it? Imagine being birds flying high above.
Saba saw a strange line across part of the image. It was thin, but skewed the boundaries between the colors. She didn't say anything about it, and she wasn't sure if it would have any bearing on Gorham's spell. Chapter 16. Lights Out. The fog outside was so thick it was nearly opaque. Aeden walked to the perimeter of the house, using his hand along the wall to guide him. He couldn't get the burning imagery out of his mind. As he turned a corner, he heard a snapping noise and lifted his foot to search for a broken stick, though he'd not felt anything. Walking toward the kitchen door, he smelled something odd. Aeden saw something glowing faintly against the house. Near the top of the staircase, a burning arrow protruded from the wood. Fire had begun to lick up the wall.
No.
Aeden mouthed the word silently through his fear. Nothing could have taken his home away, he'd thought. But here was the first strike. He ran inside, slamming the kitchen door and almost tripping over a chair. Catching himself, he realized he'd never trip over that chair again. No one would. He stopped and pushed in the chair. The house was dark without sunlight coming in. The violet light that had emanated from Gorham's study was now gone, but the painted stars still had a faint glow. Everyone must have already gone downstairs. The secret door was open, evidenced by the rectangular space without a glow. Aeden collected various paperwork, rolling it into a bundle, and entered the secret staircase. He slid the secret door closed, hoping to cover their tracks and buy more time.
He's coming!
The excitement in Niwa's voice suspended the distress and anxiety she felt. The room went silent as everyone listened to his steady steps down the curved staircase. This felt like a surprise party for my son, Gorram thought. He noticed the look of wonder on Aeden's face seeing the camera obscura.
What is this?
The image played over Aeden's face.
This is a projection of the slide you placed above,
Ricario answered.
It's time to prepare our journey.
Gorram retrieved a small bowl that held a strange candle. Aeden was thrilled his father was wasting no time. He didn't want to mention the arrow and cause everyone to panic. A loud noise came from upstairs. The floor shook and the sound of a splintering wood followed a heavy thump. Somehow, neither Gorram nor Saba seemed fazed. Saba closed her eyes, fully aware her children were looking at her for guidance. She said evenly,
Very shortly, you will find yourselves in another world. It will seem just like this world, but some things will be different. I know you'll all be brave.
She rested her hand gently on Clyde's shoulder, and the Tikas could feel her mother's hand trembling. Clyde, looking at the greens and whites splashed on the wall, suspected their parents wouldn't meet them on the other side. The reassuring words only felt foreboding to her. Another slam shook the house above. They could hear furniture toppling. Saba looked at Gorram.
This won't take long.
The dwarf glanced at the ceiling, looking slightly irritated. He held his palm near the candle and spoke some arcane words for his Create Flame spell.
In a moment, I'd like everyone to take a deep breath and hold it. Try to stay calm and focus on the image. After I light this smoke maker, would you please cast silence for me, Niwa?
The gnome was shocked to be included in this ritual, but she nodded, focusing on the small flame in her father's hand. She'd never heard of a smoke maker, but it sounded perfectly dwarven to her, much like that T-square upstairs.
The promise of another day begins, as we salute the stars and journey across the sun.
As Gorram uttered his sun-crossed spell, he let the small flame dancing in his palm climb onto the smoke maker's fuse. As the stomping and smashing continued upstairs, they heard the faint sizzle as the fuse was lit. The room went silent. Niwa whispered her arcane words as she held her hands together peacefully. The fuse met the compound within the smoke maker, and thick smoke, smelling of molasses, permeated the camera obscura. The image seemed to dissolve as smoke swallowed the light. Aeden, holding his breath and focusing on the image, felt a gentle shove. Saba was thrusting another rucksack at him, her eyes communicating he needed to take this bag. He complied with her silent wish. The room was becoming dark and smoky. They felt weary, their eyes heavy. The room felt placid and very far away. The last image Aeden remembered seeing was his mother smiling gratefully. On the next episode, as invaders destroy their home, the family uses magic to escape somewhere far away. When the siblings reopen their eyes and look around, they see a much different room. But what they can't see is much more important.
Where are Saba and Gorram?
Clyde's observation causes a flurry of anxiety in all of them.
They're not here. They're not here.
Determined to fight through her nerves, Niwa speaks of the courage of her ancestors, suddenly meeting a different visitor entirely.
Are you really here?
That's so. I've taken in my share of stray animals as well. The home is universal, isn't that right?
Ricario and Niwa head upstairs to find Aeden and Clyde, who are already off exploring. When asked about this place, he tells their visitor,
It's probably home.
Chapter 17, No Place Like Home. Next time on Across the Sun. Across the Sun Episode 3 was voiced by Danielle Bouchard as Clyde, Julia Boudreau as Niwa, Julie Dalpy as Saba, Aaron Martin Coley as Gorram, Bill Robinson as Aeden, and Jason Pagano as Ricario. Narrated by, edited, scored, mixed and mastered by Thomas Wells. Some sounds and music acquired from Zapsplat.com.